Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. I have to say it's getting easier each week to plan the show because you guys have been so vocal about the program.
Shucks, I'm speechless.
No, I really mean it. On the show this week, we have what I think is the funniest story we've ever had.
What do you mean? Funny haha or funny peculiar?
I mean, haha. We have a UFO story, a history lesson from New England, and Tom's back with Growing Up, a short story. Also, we continue with Randall Garrett's novel, Anything You Can Do, and of course, it all begins with this 5-minute mystery.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Too Much Information. When you're ready to spill your beans, always remember less is more, and more will always get you into trouble, especially if you're trying to hide a murder. So let's get to today's story.
Hello?
Mr. Barron, this is Ed Chavers.
Hello, Constable.
I've got some mighty unpleasant news for you, Mr. Barron. Carter Hogue, the high school principal, has been murdered.
What?
I'll have to ask you to come down to the office for a few minutes. I'd like to ask you some questions.
Of course, Constable. I'll be right over. Constable, this is all a tremendous shock to me. Not only was Carter Hogue my colleague at the school, but one of my best friends as well.
I know, Mr. Barron. It's been a shock to us all.
How did it happen?
As far as I know, someone crept in through the window of Hogue's house and struck him over the head as he sat in his study.
Any clues?
Not a one. What I wanted to ask you was if you have any idea as to who could have had a motive for killing him.
The only thing I can think of is the threat made by Darrell Lewis's father when he found out that Carter had hit his son.
You heard about that. It's bad business hitting that boy.
I was there when it happened. The boy provoked the incident by his surly behavior, but it was unfortunate that Carter lost his temper.
Well, that's the only clue I have, so I called Mr. Lewis on the phone right after you. You ought to be here any minute.
This all seems like a horrible dream, Constable. You can count on me to help in any way I can.
Thank you, Mr. Barron. I will. Come in.
Good evening, Constable. I'm Darrell Lewis's father.
Come in, please. Any idea why I sent for you?
A little. You must have heard about the threat I made to the principal when I found out he hit my kid.
That was a dangerous thing to say.
I lost my head. Hogue had no right to lay a hand on my kid.
Mr. Lewis, Carter Hogue is dead. Murdered.
Dead? Now, see here. I know what you're thinking, and you're dead wrong. I'm innocent.
You're protesting your innocence rather loudly, Mr. Lewis.
Now, look here, Mr. Barron. I'm not the polished gentleman you are, but I can still protect my rights.
Doesn't look good for you, my friend. When you threaten to kill a man and then 2 days later he's murdered, it's more than coincidence.
You better close your mouth, teacher, or I'll do it for you.
Perhaps I'd better. I don't want to have you sneaking up on me and smashing in my skull with a bookend like you did to poor Carter Hogue.
Why, you dirty...
Easy there, Mr. Lewis, easy. You stop this cross-examining, Barron. There'll be plenty of time for it in the courtroom at your trial.
What?
You killed Carter Hogue, and I can prove it.
How does Constable Ed Chavers know that Sam Barron is the murderer of Carter Hogue? In just a moment, we'll know, but first...
Okay, the things I like about this story. Well, it was short, and while we talked about motive this time, our proposed killer doesn't seem to have any. Also, the father threatened to kill the victim. All in all, that usually means he didn't do it. But the tale was very good and well acted. In fact, for once, we have enough clues to solve it. Did you catch the mistake?
And now, back to our story.
Unfortunately for you, Mr. Barron, in your attempt to pin the murder on Mr. Lewis here, you became too dramatic in describing the scene and the action. How did you know that Hogue had been struck with a bookend? I didn't tell you, and you hadn't seen the body. Only the man who committed the murder could have known what the weapon was. You protested Mr. Lewis's guilt too loudly, Mr. Barron. You only proved him innocent.
That's right. Too much information. If only Mr. Barron had kept his mouth shut, he might have gotten away with it. But no, he upset the proverbial apple cart, and the constable picked them up, inspected each and every one, and saw the truth that this 5-minute mystery was brought to you by Too Much Information. How about that?
What's that you say?
I have to say thank you again this week. We've worked on restoring our Twitter following, and 2 more of you took the listener survey. Thank you for that. By the way, the survey takes about 5 minutes to complete, asks questions about you, but requires no personal information. You can find the link to the survey at ronsamazingstories.com, and I'm telling you, this really will help the podcast. I received this email from MacCO772. Hello, Ron. I've been a listener to the show for quite a while now, and I love the direction things are going. Tom Williams is amazing, and lately the stories have been nothing short of amazing. I want to share my story with you, but I'm not a writer, and I don't want to have anything to do with public speaking. How do you handle this? Well, Mac, that is an easy answer. If you have a story to tell, and you don't want to write it, and you don't want to come on the show and tell it, then what I do is give you a call and you tell me your story. Then I write it, read it, and give you the credit. Just head to the main website, click on the contact tab, leave a phone number, a brief note, and a possible few times that you're available to chat. And that's it. Many folks have taken advantage of this, and I love to talk to people and hear their own stories. Thank you, Mac. Just a reminder, I'm planning a special military episode of the podcast, so if you have a story to share on the subject, please head to Ron's Amazing Stories and click on that story submission banner. And now, these are your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story is a UFO tale. Kind of. It sounds like something I would do if given the chance. It comes from the hot city of Phoenix, Arizona, and may explain those strange lights that they have in the sky. Okay, it doesn't do that, but it is pretty good. It was sent in by Sharon K., and it goes something like this. Backyard UFO by Sharon K. It was a Saturday morning, and I know this because the night before was Friday. We had gone out with friends and may have had a good time. I really don't remember. What I do know is that there was a rather loud banging sound, and it was causing my head to respond in a negative manner. The problem with this noise is that it wasn't stopping, and it was obvious that I was going to have to go investigate it. I fell out of bed. No, really, I mean I fell out of bed and landed on my husband, who had, the night before, almost made it to bed. His eyes flashed open, and it was clear that the banging was also impacting him unfavorably. I could swear he was an off-green color. Foreshadowing? Who's to say? I thought for sure that the banging was a punishment from God, but it turned out that it was actually the front door. I stopped by the kitchen, splashed some water on my face, oh man, that felt good, and walked the remaining distance to the offending object and looked out the window. What I saw, I will never forget. Before we continue, I must tell you about our house. It is a 2-story townhouse in a cul-de-sac full of townhouses. They are in groups of 2 with a 7-foot fence between them, blocking the shared backyard. There is no way to get into the backyard except through the lock gate or through the house. Both our neighbors and ourselves keep that gate locked at all times to prevent sharing the pool with every Tom, Peter, and Clyde. Our neighbors, who are very close friends, were out of town on vacation, which is probably why... Well, let's get back to the story. What I saw will change my life forever. Okay, that might be a bit of drama, but it is my story after all. Our driveway was full of people all making strange sounds and were being led by a group of newspaper reporters. They had video cameras, boom mics, and the annoying habit of making a lot of noise. By now, my husband was with me and also looking at the crowd. He calmly said, "Honey, I don't think we're going to get out of this alive." I had to agree, opened the door, and waited for their leader to step up. "Did a UFO land in your backyard?" A pretentious woman dressed far too well for her own good had stuck a mic into my face. I looked to my husband, and his face was one of extreme despair and confusion. "I know. I don't think so," I managed to say, and then the reporter launched into her story. It appears the night before, a UFO had been spotted flying around the neighborhood. It was silent and began to attract attention around the block. People were taking pictures and calling the police. The investigation led to our house, where the UFO was reportedly followed and vanished, seemingly crash-landing into our backyard. After we were told this story, I was in total denial and disbelief. People wanted us to unlock the gate and allow the investigation to begin. This is where my husband stepped up. Did I mention he was a big man? He has 2 jobs. He is a stuntman and a bounty hunter. Yep, right out of the TV show The Fall Guy, starring Lee Majors. Not quite as handsome as Lee, but I can live with that. He told the crowd that he would not be unlocking the gate, and the first to try would meet with his wrath, or something like that. Either way, no one attempted to open the gate. He did say, "We will investigate, and you will wait here." We closed the door, had a good laugh, and then went into the backyard. We did find a VIFO in the bottom of our pool. It was clear that it in fact had crash-landed, and if there were any alien occupants, they had all drowned. By the way, VIFO stands for Very Identifiable Flying Object. For sitting in the bottom of our pool was a large drone. We saw a chance for some fun and went back to the front door. My husband told the crowd that a UFO had indeed crash-landed in our backyard. He went on to say that they were caring for the injured and would be out later to address the crowd. We excused ourselves by saying that we had to bring their medics some bandages. Also, to remain here until further notice. The crowd was silent. We turned and went back inside, and as Mel B from America's Got Talent would say, had a proper belly laugh. We waited about 10 minutes and then went back out to the waiting crowd. Grinning ear to ear, my husband told them the truth. Some were angry, most laughed, and the reporter wanted the story. We opened the gate, and they got their pictures of the crash site. Sharon K., Phoenix, Arizona. Sharon went on to say that the story never made the evening news. The drone's owner showed up and retrieved his ill-fated property, and the K's recovered from their illness. I have to say that this is one of the funniest stories I've ever had to read on the show, and I can't thank Sharon and Mike enough for telling it. Our next story is amazing. It was sent in by Thomas Godwin, who is a New England history professor. The story begins during the Civil War about 1861, when a young Confederate soldier was captured and imprisoned at Fort Warren on George's Island in Boston. When no one would help the young man's wife get in touch with her husband, she decided to rescue him herself. Her name has been bandied around a lot, but most people say it was Melanie Lanier. The legend is that she took the train up from Massachusetts, where she is said to have stayed overnight in Hull with the island fort visible from the shore. The next day she dressed herself in men's clothing, caught a boat across to the harbor, and found her way to the fort. Apparently she was able to free her husband from the cell, but during the escape attempt, they were caught. She attempted to shoot a soldier who was trying to intercept them, and instead the gun misfired and she killed her own husband. It was then discovered that she was a woman and she would be executed as a spy. They dressed her in a black cloak before she was executed, and she was hung 7 days later. Fort Warren was owned by the U.S. federal government until 1958. In 1961, it was reopened to the public after an initial restoration. Today, the state maintains and administers the property, which is the centerpiece of Boston Harbor. The fort is reachable by ferry from various locations around the harbor. Transfers are then available to those who wish to visit the actual site. Visitors to Fort Warren say Melanie's ghost still haunts the fortress, and that she is said to be a very violent ghost. The reports are that when she's been spotted, she lashes out by pushing, and people have experienced scratches and cuts. Thomas visited the fort in 2009 with a few of his students, and this is his story. We were permitted to research and investigate Fort Warren on George's Island in 2009. We were allowed full access, and our investigation was not limited to daylight hours. The plan was to try to validate claims of ghost activity and find evidence of the paranormal. I selected several students to join me. Our investigation went flawlessly, and we found no evidence during our stay at the fort. It was an enjoyable experience, and most felt well worth the effort. We collected nearly 20 hours of video, audio, and other data which we plan to review as a group. We thanked the caretakers and left the island. When we returned home, we began the long, arduous job of review. We decided to be vigilant, and each piece would receive no fewer than 3 examinations. Everything was clear except for one recording made at the Bartlett Battery. While no one knows for sure where Melanie was hung, one plausible location was at this battery. The investigators were having trouble with their recorder and were talking about how poorly the interface was laid out. In the background, an angry woman's voice clearly says,
"What are you people doing here?"
After reviewing the project logs, it was determined that there were only 2 people on that battery at that time, and both of them were men. I know that this is not much of a story, but I hope the background information is interesting enough to include it in the show. Thank you for your podcast. I admire the work you do, and if you would like a copy of the audio, let me know. Thomas Godwin, Boston. Well, Thomas, I would like to hear that recording, so please send it along. You can email it or attach it to a comment at the website. Thank you for your story, and it was more than interesting enough for the show. Our last story comes from Kihei, Hawaii. It was sent in by Kahale Mahalona, and this is our first story from the islands. Hello, Ron. I am a UFO junkie, and if I had one wish for your show, it would be that more people sent in their stories about UFOs. Since I was a child, I wanted to see a UFO, and it finally happened. I'm both excited by it and bewildered. While not too exciting, it is true. It was around 12:15 a.m. I was scanning the night sky in the direction of Kaupu. I do this often because my theory is that if you're not watching, then you're missing. I noticed an unusually bright light, and it was pretty high in the sky. It was brighter than any star or planet, and too bright to be a satellite, not in a typical flight pattern of an airplane, and too high to be a helicopter or drone. I decided to watch it for a while to see what would happen. After about 5 minutes, it split into 2 lights and then proceeded to fly apart in diagonal trajectories for another 5 minutes. The lights then reversed direction, became 1 again, and remained that way for the next 10 minutes. I was tired and went to bed, although had some difficulty sleeping. My thoughts were, what were they doing, and why would they separate and then rejoin? I'll be watching that part of the sky whenever I get the chance, hoping that I will see them again and hoping to receive information about why they're here and what they're doing. I would love to hear about other people's UFO experiences. It feels good to know that we are definitively not alone. Thank you for the show and mahalo. Kahale, Mahi Alona, Hawaii. Well, thank you, Kahale, for your story. I did some research, and there have been a number of sightings similar to yours reported on MUFON and other sites. Also, I think more people must be watching the skies like yourself because UFO reports are on the increase since 2016. And I often wonder why we don't get more stories like this on the podcast. And those are your stories. As you know, we've been listening to the book Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. Starting this week, the guy that has been narrating the book will also be introducing the chapters. So here is friend of the podcast, Mark Nelson.
Welcome back to another installment of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. The story so far. In chapters 1 through 3, we were introduced to the Nipe. The Nipe is an interstellar alien who, in a damaged spacecraft, after killing and eating his own brother, crash lands in Siberia. There he meets and kills an unfortunate forest ranger. What has our Nipe been up to since? We will find out in Chapter 4 of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett.
Government City was something of a paradox. It was the largest capital city, in terms of population, that had ever been built on Earth. And yet, again in terms of population, it was nowhere near as large as Tokyo or London. The solution to the paradox lies in discovering that the term population is used in 2 different senses, thus exposing the logical fallacy of the undistributed middle. If, in referring to London or Tokyo, the term population is restricted to those and only those who are actively engaged in the various phases of actual government, as it is when referring to Government City, the apparent paradox resolves itself. Built on the slagged-down remains of New York's Manhattan Island, which had been destroyed by a sun bomb during the Holocaust nearly a century before, Government City occupied all but the upper 3 miles of the island, and the population consisted almost entirely of men and women engaged, either directly or indirectly, in the business of governing a planet. There were no shopping centers and no entertainment areas. The small personal flyer, almost the same size as the old gasoline-driven automobile, could, because of its inertia drive, move with the 3-dimensional ability of a hummingbird, so the rivers that cut the island off from the mainland were no barrier. The shopping and entertainment centers of Brooklyn, Queens, and Jersey were only 5 minutes away, even through the thickest, slowest-moving traffic. It was the personal flyer, not the clumsy airplane, that had really eliminated distance along with national boundaries. The majority of the government officers' homes were off the island too, but this commuting did not cause any great fluctuation of the island's population. A city that governs a planet must operate at full capacity 24 hours a day, and there was a rush hour every 3 hours as the staggered 6-hour shifts changed. Physically, the planet still revolved about the sun. Politically, Earth revolved around Government City. In one of the towering buildings, a group of men sat comfortably in a medium-sized room, watching a screen that, because of the three-dimensional quality and the color fidelity of the scene it showed, might have been a window, except that the angle was wrong. They were looking down from an apparent height of 40 feet on a clearing in a paper tree forest in Siberia. The clearing was not a natural one. The trees had been splintered, uprooted, and pushed away from the center of the long elliptical area. The center of the area was apparently empty. One of the men, whose fingers were touching a control panel in the arm of his chair, said, "That is where the ship made its crash landing. As you can see from the relatively light damage, it was moving at no great speed when it hit. From the little information we have, mostly from a momentary radar recording made when the incoming vessel was picked up for a few seconds by the instruments of Transpolar Airways, when it crossed the path of one of their freight orbits, it is estimated that the craft was decelerating at between 15 and 17 gravities. The rate of change of acceleration in centimeters per second cubed is unknown, but obviously so small as to be negligible. This picture was taken by the fire prevention flyers that came in response to an urgent call by the assistant of the forest ranger, who is in charge of this section." "There was no fire?" asked one of the other men, looking closely at the image. "None," said the speaker. "We can't yet say what actually happened to the ship. We have only a couple of hints. One of our weather observers, orbiting at 400 miles, picked up a tremendous flash of hard ultraviolet radiation in the area, around the 3,000 angstrom band. There must have been quite a bit of shorter wavelength radiation, but the Earth's atmosphere would filter most of it out. A recording of the radiophone discussion between the ranger and his assistant is the only other description we have. The ranger described a bluish glow over the site. Part of that may have been due to actual blue light given off by the, well, call it burning. That word will do for now. But some of the blue glow was almost certainly due to ionization of the air by the hard ultraviolet. Look at this next picture. The scene remained the same, and yet there was a definite change. This was taken 3 days later. If you'll notice, the normal rust red of the foliage has darkened to a purplish brown in the area around the crash site. Now, a Martian paper tree, even in the mutated form, is quite resistant to UV, since it evolved under the thin atmosphere of Mars, which gives much less protection from ultraviolet radiation than Earth's does. Nevertheless, those trees have a bad case of sunburn. "And no heat," said a third man. "Wow." "Oh, there was some heat, but not anywhere near what you'd expect. The nearer trees were rather dry, as though they'd been baked, but only at the surface, and the temperature probably didn't rise much above 150 centigrade. "How about X-rays?" asked still another man. "Anything shorter than 100 angstroms detected?" "No. If there was any radiation that hard, there was no detector close enough to measure it. We doubt, frankly, whether there was any." "The fire, if you want to call it that, must have stunk up the place pretty badly," said one of the men dryly. "It did. There were still traces of ozone and various oxides of nitrogen in the air when the fire prevention flyers arrived. The wind carried them away from the ranger, so he didn't get a whiff of them. And this fire, it destroyed the ship completely?" "Almost completely. There are some lumps of metal around, but we can't make anything of them yet. Some of them are badly fused, but that damage was probably done before the ship landed. Certainly, there was not enough heat generated after the crash to have done that damage. His hand moved over the control panel in the armrest of his chair, and the scene changed. This was taken from the ground. Those lumps you see are the pieces of metal I was talking about. Notice the fine, white, powdery ash, which caused the white spot that you could see from the air. That is evidently all that is left of the hull and the rest of the ship. None of it is radioactive. Random samplings from various parts of the area show that the ash consists of magnesium, lithium, and beryllium carbonates. "You don't mean oxides?" said one of the others. "No, I mean carbonates, and some silicate. We estimate that the remaining ash could not have constituted more than 10% of the total mass of the hull of the ship. The rest of it vaporized, apparently into carbon dioxide and water." "Some kind of plastic?" hazarded one of the men. "Undoubtedly, if you want to use a catch-all term like plastic. But what kind of plastic goes to pieces like that?" That rhetorical question was answered by a silence. "There's no doubt," said one of them after a moment, "that circumstantial evidence alone would link the alien with the ship. But have you any more conclusive evidence?" The hand moved, and the scene changed again. It was not a pretty scene. That, as you can see, is a close-up of the late Wang Kulichenko, the forest ranger who was the only man ever to see the alien ship before it was destroyed. Notice the peculiar bruises on the cheek and ear, the whole side of the head. The pattern is quite similar on the other side of the head. "It looks, rather like a handprint." "It is. Kulichenko was slapped, hard, on both sides of his head. It crushed his skull." There was an intake of breath. "The next picture," the scene changed, "shows the whole body. If you'll look closely, you'll see the same sort of prints on the ground around it, all very much like handprints. And that ties in very well with the photographs of the alien itself." "There's no doubt about it," said one of the others. "The connection is definitely there." The lecturer's hand moved over the control panel again, and suddenly the screen was filled with the image of an 8-limbed horror with 4 glaring violet eyes. In spite of themselves, a couple of the men gasped. They had seen the photographs before, but a full-sized, 3-dimensional color projection is something else again. Until 3 weeks ago, we knew of no explanation for the peculiar happenings in northern Asia. After 8 months of investigation, we found ourselves up against a blank wall. Nothing could account for that peculiar fire, nor for the queer circumstances surrounding the death of the forest ranger. The investigator suspected an intelligent alien life form, but, well, the notion simply seemed too fantastic. Attempts to trail the being by means of those peculiar footprints failed. They ended at a riverbank and apparently never came out again. We know now that it swam downstream for over 100 miles. Little wonder it got away. Even those investigators who suspected something non-human pictured the being as humanoid, or rather anthropoid in form. The prints certainly suggest those of an ape. There appeared to be 4 of them, judging by the prints, although frequently there were only 3 and sometimes only 2. It all depended on how many of his feet he felt like walking on. "And then the whole herd of them dived into a river and never came up again, eh?" remarked one of the listeners. "Exactly. You can see why the investigators kept the whole thing quiet. Nothing more was seen, heard, or reported for 8 months. Then, 3 weeks ago, a non-vision phone call was received by the secretary of the Board of Regents of the Khrushchev Memorial Psychiatric Hospital in Leningrad. An odd, breathy voice, speaking very bad Russian, offered a meeting. It was the alien. He managed to explain, in spite of the language handicap, that he did not want to be mistaken for a wild animal, as had happened with the forest ranger. The secretary, Mr. Rogov, felt that the speaker was probably deranged, but, as he said later, there was something about that voice that didn't sound human. He said he would make arrangements and asked the caller to contact him again the next day. The alien agreed. Rogov then— "Excuse me," one of the men interrupted apologetically, "but did he learn Russian all by himself, or has it been established that someone taught him the language?" "The evidence is that he learned it all by himself, from scratch, in those 8 months." "I see. Excuse my interruption. Go on." Mr. Rogov was intrigued by the story he had heard. He decided to check on it. He made a few phone calls, asking questions about a mysterious crash in the paper forests and the death of a forest ranger. Naturally, those who did know were curious about how Mr. Rogov had learned so much about the incident. He told them. By the time the alien made his second call, a meeting had been arranged. When he showed up, those of the board who were still of the opinion that the call had been made by a crank or a psychosis case changed their minds very rapidly. "I can see why," murmured someone. "The alien's ability to use Russian is limited," the speaker continued. "He picked up vocabulary and grammatical rules very rapidly, but he seemed completely unable to use the language beyond discussion of concrete objects and actions. His mind is evidently too alien to enable him to do more than touch the edges of human communication. For instance, he called himself Nipe or Nipe, but we don't know whether that refers to him as an individual or as a member of his race. Since Russian lacks both definite and indefinite articles, it is possible that he was calling himself a Nipe or the Nipe. Certainly, that's the impression he gave. In the discussions that followed, several peculiarities were noticed, as you can read in detail in the reports that the board and the government staff prepared. For instance, in discussing mathematics, the Nipe seemed to be completely at a loss. He apparently thought of mathematics as a spoken language rather than a written one, and could not progress beyond simple diagrams. That's just one small example. I'm just trying to give you a brief outline now. You can read the reports for full information. He refused to allow any physical tests on his body, and, short of threatening him at gunpoint, there was no practicable way to force him to accede to our wishes. Naturally, threats were out of the question. "Couldn't X-rays have been taken surreptitiously?" asked one of the men. "It was discussed and rejected. We have no way of knowing what his tolerance to radiation is, and we didn't want to harm him. The same applies to using any anesthetic gas or drug to render him unconscious. There was no way to study his metabolism without his cooperation, unless we were willing to risk killing him." "I see. Naturally, we couldn't harm him." "Exactly. The Nipe had to be treated as an emissary from his home world, wherever that may be. He has killed a man, yes, but that has to be allowed as justifiable homicide in self-defense, since the forester had drawn a gun and was ready to fire. Nobody can blame the late Wang Kulichenko for that, but nobody can blame the Nipe either." They all looked for a moment in silence at the violet eyes that gazed at them from the screen. "For nearly 3 weeks," the speaker went on, "humans and Nipe tried to arrive at a meeting of minds, and just when it would seem that such a meeting was within grasp, it would fade away into mist. It was only 3 days ago that the Russian psychologists and psychiatrists realized that the reason the Nipe had come to them was because he thought that the Board of Regents of the hospital was the ruling body of that territory." Someone chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Now we come to yesterday morning," said the speaker. "This is the important part at this very moment, because it explains why I feel we must immediately take steps to tell the public what has happened, why I feel that it is necessary to put a man like Colonel Walter Mannheim in charge of the Nipe affair, and keep him in charge until the matter is cleared up. because the public is going to be scared witless if we don't do something to reassure them. "What happened yesterday morning, Mr. President?" one of the men asked. The Nipe got angry, lost his temper, went mad, whatever you want to call it. At the morning meeting, he simply became more and more incomprehensible. The psychologists were trying to see if the Nipe had any religious beliefs, and if so, what they were. One of them, a Dr. Valachek, was explaining the various religious sects and rites here on Earth. Suddenly, with no warning whatever, the Nipe chopped at Valachek's throat with an open-hand judo cut, killing him. He killed 2 more men before he leapt out of the window and vanished. No trace of him was found until late last night. He killed another man in Leningrad. We have since discovered that it was for the purpose of stealing his personal flyer. The Nipe could be anywhere on Earth by now. How was the man killed, Mr. President? With bare hands as the others were? We have no way of knowing. Identification of the body was made difficult by the fact that every shred of flesh had been stripped away. It had been gnawed, literally eaten to the bone.
That's all for this time. Come back for the next chapter of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. Sometimes when I'm searching the internet, I find stories that make me say, wow. Even more rare is when I find a story that makes me say, wow, and it's clear of any copyright issue. Such is the case of this next tale. It comes to us from April 4th, 1945, and I'm going to let it speak for itself.
The battle order, the schedule of operations for this great airborne landing in Germany, took up a score of pages of typewritten foolscap, with appendices and charts and timetables and maps. By reading it, you could see how immensely complicated is such an operation. In fact, how great a triumph today has been for Allied planning and execution. The Germans had said that they were ready for airborne landings. They were not, I think, expecting anything quite as powerful and concentrated as this, the biggest airborne force ever carried in one attack. It was British and American, flying parallel within easy sight of each other. The Halifaxes and the Stirlings towing their Horsers and Hamel cars, the Dakotas each drawing their 2 Wacko gliders. Around us all, giving encouraging flashes in the sun, dashed the little fighters, British and American too. Some from bases in England, some from the forward airfields on the northwestern front. Slowly, I thought contemptuously, the great air fleet moved into Germany. It was so long that the head of the procession was now passing us on its way out. A Stirling shot by with flames coming from its belly. 4 white parachutes fled from it and opened and swayed off down to the river bank. The Stirling crashed in a great gout of flame. You thought of the human element then. I looked back to see it through one of our rear windows and caught the eye of Bob Wade, my engineer, crouched over his apparatus. I knew that he'd seen it too. Ahead of us, German flak was staining the sky with its blue-black ink spots. Another tug went down, flaming. No one got out. The tail broke off a glider behind us and went spinning away. The glider paused a second as though surprised, and then reared up and fell, somersaulting. There are no parachutes in gliders. We were almost on the dropping zone now, the patchwork of fields that I'd seen marked out on large-scale photographs, lying below us in the glare of the sun and a dazzling mist. We called up Hamilcar 277 for the last time. You are over your dropping zone now. The Halifax skipped a little as the glider let go. We turned sharply, and a great bunch of flak turned with us just off the starboard wing. 277 wheeled away beautifully, and then I lost sight of her as she joined the hundreds of others, banking silently down like a flight of tired moths, seeking their rest on the ground. And as we turned, I saw simultaneously the smoke of 5 aircraft, blazing like torches in the fields and the woods just below. Some German guns fired, and the Typhoons, who were patrolling on the lookout for just such a thing, swooped and were gone down in a flash to strafe the gunners. Our fighter protection had been first class, but you can't subdue everyone, and there were some of our force who paid the price for hauling their gliders to the right spot at the right time. We, who were lucky, edged out of it and belted back for the Rhine. where Allied guns were setting up grey smoke clouds and Allied craft were crossing the broad river. There were tanks closing up in the winding roads of the West Bank and great convoys of lorries. Below us, the army was on the move into Germany. And back in the flak stains and the mist, its spearhead was now on the ground and fighting, by the empty hulks of the gliders, among the black pillars of smoke, the funeral pyres of some of those whose pride it had been to lead the spearhead in.
That was Richard Dembley reporting from the BBC. It was presented with no enhancements by me, so what you heard is what was played on April 4th, 1945. How about that?
As read by amazing stories, read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we continue with the Growing Up series of stories from Tom Williams. This time, Tom tells us all about paper routes and dogs.
Growing Up, a short story. There was a chinaberry tree across from Grandma's house, and these chinaberries were hard as rocks, which made them perfect for slingshot wars. "You boys are going to put your eyes out," we'd always hear from some door or window from an unseen adult. To the right of that tree, and a little ways back on an empty lot, was a small building which we call the paper house. It was where bulk delivery of newspapers were left for my friend to fold for delivery to each customer. He would fold each one into a perfect triangle in order to pitch it onto the porches without getting off his bicycle. The only time he would get off his bicycle was on the days he had to collect. And for us to make sure he would have time to play with us, we would gather around and fold each newspaper into a perfect aerodynamic object. It had to be just right. He had an excellent aim, too. Probably became a baseball pitcher later on, for all I know. And the only thing that would mess up his side throw was an occasional neighborhood stray dog which would bound out from under the house, grab the paper, and hightail it down the street, never to be seen again. I've often wondered what happened to all those newspapers that Mutt stole and buried. On the other hand, it could have been some person who trained his dog to get him a free newspaper each day. That neighborhood, and particularly that street, had several dogs that just didn't like bicycles. Don't know why. I did. You had to be fast to get where you were going. There was one dog that didn't particularly like me on a bike when I was able to borrow one. That soon changed, though. One day I borrowed my cousin Fred's bike. Now, with that right pants leg folded up into a cuff, I set out for a pleasant ride. I was having so much fun I forgot about my number one enemy waiting at the end of the street where I made my turnaround. The dog suddenly charged. I lost some speed because I had to turn around and then accelerate. Cranking the pedals as fast as I could, the dog caught up with me in seconds. He lunged at my right leg, and one of his fangs got hooked into the cuff of my pants. There he was caught, with his head bobbing up and down with every stroke of the pedal. He was never able to free himself until several houses later, and when I looked back to see if he was still after me, I noticed that he had staggered to the side of the road and looked pretty dizzy and couldn't walk straight. I waited a week or so to go that way again, and once I did, there was that same dog, but patiently waiting on the porch and calmly watched me go by. He was never the same again, that dog. I believe he just lost interest. It just wasn't worth all that work. Yours truly, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. I grew up with paper routes as well, but I didn't get my first one until I was 18. I was actually a bundle spotter. You see, I was the guy that delivered the papers to the kids that delivered the papers. Each day I would go to the loading docks, pick up my bundles, and drive around the city, putting them on their spots. It's a real job. Today, they don't do that anymore. Paper boys are gone now, having been usurped by paper adults. These adults wait in line while trucks unload their papers. It's kind of sad, really. Paper routes were a kid's best friend. For those of you who don't know, Tom lives in Germany, was raised in the South, and has sent in these stories from his youth. You can expect to hear more of them in upcoming episodes. And so we close the show again. I want to thank our contributors this week: Mac Coe, Sharon and Mike K, Thomas Godwin, Mark Nelson, and of course, Tom Williams. You are all amazing. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, it's so easy to do. Just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you'll find all of the links you need. We are on Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many other services. Pick one and do leave some feedback about the show. It really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.